we're going to talk about another great jazz personality who was actually born in the same year as Bix Beiderbecke, 1903. The difference is both of his family members, mother and father, supported his musical career, and as a result, he did not develop a lot of the habits that plagued Bix Beiderbecke. Hence, he lived a very long life, into the 80s, 83, I think, 80 years old, thereabouts. And his career pretty much was active almost the entire time. So he is responsible for a whole lot of innovation and a whole lot of great music. There's so much, so let's get started here. He's born in 1903 in Duquesne, Pennsylvania. And Duquesne, many don't know, Duquesne University is in Pittsburgh. They say in Pittsburgh. Duquesne is basically 12 miles from the center of Pittsburgh. So pretty much it's kind of like a little suburb. You call it a suburb now of Pittsburgh. I think by now Pittsburgh is simply grown and encompassed poor little Duquesne. But he was born to a guitar-playing father and a piano-playing mother. And they nurtured him in music. They supported it because that's what they did. Now, they were not wealthy. They struggled. But he started his journey with the piano at about 6 years of age. And pretty soon, he was confident enough to be playing small local gigs. And by the age of 17, he was able to take his first real professional gig, and it wasn't a jazz gig. He was playing with a more symphonic-oriented player named Louis Dupay, who had a very great baritone voice, was very, very famous in the region and nationally, actually, for that matter. And young Earl was his accompanist. The very first radio broadcast to feature a black person was a radio broadcast featuring Mr. Dupay and Earl Fatha Hines. So from the very beginning, innovator, pacemaker, one of a kind. And this gig lasted for a while. He got a little bit of money. He got free room and board, you know. Make sure I'm eating, make sure I got a place to sleep, give me some money to have a little fun with. And his fame is growing. Not just in the Pittsburgh area, but, you know, musicians travel. So as people come through Pittsburgh, they go, man, I heard this piano player, I heard this piano player, I heard this piano player. Next thing you know, he's in Chicago. Took him a while to get there because his parents were not so sure that moving to Chicago was a good idea because, you know, there was a lot of stuff going on in Chicago at that time. You had that boy Al Capone and all that gangsterism going on and all that shooting, and you had a lot going on. Chicago was a pretty wild city compared to little conservative Pittsburgh. So they were thinking about their son's safety, but they had raised him right. They knew he had a talent. They knew he had to go and spread his wings. So they said, all right, son, you need to go ahead, and we just gonna pray for you. So off to Chicago he goes, and he's playing here and he's playing there, and somewhere along the way, he developed this piano style that was different from what anybody else was doing. Most people playing block chords with both hands and whatnot, and you know, straight time, stride piano with the left hand, you know. But Fatha Hines, he had a little syncopation going to the left hand, just punctuating some accents, syncopation here and there, and playing lines that move with that right hand because he had great technique. That's how he had great technique. And a lot of guys call it trumpeting because when you played in these bands in those days, you were not always guaranteed to have a great instrument. You know, you can't carry a piano on your back, so you're at the mercy of the club owner. What piano am I going to have? That thing over there. Oh my God, that's what you got to play. So Fatha Hines, Earl Fatha Hines, developed this technique where he would play his lines in octaves. So you're doubling the note, which means you're doubling the strength, which means it can penetrate and cut through and be heard inside the band, regardless of how bad this instrument actually is. And he had this little tremolo thing he would do, which kind of imitated trumpet vibrato. So a lot of the people started calling his style of piano trumpeting. And that moniker got even more attached to him when he met his friend and collaborator for many, many years to come, Mr. Louis Armstrong. When Louis has got his Hot 5 and Hot 7, and his wife, Miss Lil Hardin Armstrong, is playing the piano, and he meets Earl, and they checking each other out. He's going, man, I like the way you play. Earl like, what? He said, no, you remind me of me. The way you play those lines on the piano reminds me of. He said, well, yeah, I got a little secret to tell you. He said, what's that? He says, well, my father actually played trumpet too. He was more of a trumpet player than a guitar player, actually. And I wanted to play the trumpet. But whenever I would play, I would get this pain behind my ears, and so I switched to the piano to avoid the pain, but I still want to do those same kind of things, so maybe that's why I sound like a trumpet player with my right hand, because that's really what I wanted to do. And Pop said, well, I like it. And Earl said, well, thank you. Well, next thing you know, Lil Hardin Armstrong, Mrs. Armstrong, is no longer the piano for the Hot 5. Oh no. She becomes the manager and business agent because she loved her Louis so much. Did I tell you about she wrote that song called Strutting with Some Barbecue? We'll talk about that another time for her husband. He liked his barbecue, he liked her, she liked him. So she said, okay, I heard this guy Earl play. Yeah, he can definitely outplay me, baby. So since you're trying to build your career, we making these recordings, we're gonna let Earl take my place, and I'll just manage everything and get you booked and make sure everything's like it's supposed to be, and there it goes. So the Hot 5 added Earl. And those recordings where Earl on it becomes famous. Everyone knows these things if you don't go out and find them. It's amazing. The difference in the sound of these bands when Lil played, and she was not a bad player, and when Fatha Hines played. Now, they were playing a club called the Sunset Club in Chicago, and that lasted great until the Sunset closed in 1927. We are approaching the stock market crash and blah, 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 so money's getting kind of tight in a few little places, and for some reason the Sunset crashes, and all of a sudden, Zuddy, who played drums and were great friends with Louis and Earl, they had this thing, we're gonna be the three amigos, we're gonna be the three thises, we're gonna be the three that's, and we ain't gonna play with nobody unless they hire all three of us. Okay. Well, Earl took off and went to New York for a short while. And when he came back, he found out that Zuddy and Satch had joined another band. I think they may have been with Fletcher Henderson's band or something. And he was a little bit angry about that because they had promised they were not going to do that unless everybody went. So there he was, out of work in Chicago. Expecting to come back to a job, there was no job. So now what are they going to do? Well, he's going to start his own thing. And of course, late in the 20s, you have this transition taking place from the small New Orleans type bands to the swing bands that are big orchestras. Thank you, Fletcher Henderson. Now Benny Goodman is coming out there, and Paul Whiteman, all these big bands are coming out. And Fatha Hines ends up putting together a big band. And he didn't hire Zuddy, and he didn't hire Louis. That little war continued for a while. But it worked out great for Father Hines. Because you see, the Grand Terrace was in the same building as the Sunset had been. So you could almost say he got his old gig back. But it was much nicer this time. The original place had been owned and managed by Louis Armstrong's business manager. And this new version, the Grand Terrace, let's just say it had some financial backing from people who had, well, mob connections. As a matter of fact, it was a well-known fact that the chief partner was Al Capone. And so there is Earl with his big band playing in the former Sunset Cafe that is now the Terrace, and his boss is a well-known murderer. We all know this. And of course, to get started, Al came in and just told him, look, if you want to keep this gig, you got to be like them three monkeys. You know the three monkeys? See no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. He said, if you can do that, you'll last a long time. And if not, well, you might have to go for a long swim in a lake. Well, Earl understood that very well. And to, how should I say this, demonstrate his understanding, he stayed there for 10 years. And the band grew from 15 members to as many as 28 musicians. Oh yeah, it was happening. When you got some money, you got it happening. Plus you also got prohibition. And who got the liquor? Al Capone. Where can you get the liquor? The Sunset Terrace. And Al Capone, as an Italian, was probably one of the least racist that there was. Because the only color he was concerned with was green. You see, the Sunset was what it was, but the Grand Terrace was what we call a black and tan club. That meant that black people and white people came there together and were treated equally. This is at the same time that in New York City, New York, the Big Apple has the Cotton Club, and they're still treating us like we picking cotton because only white folks can come in the front door. Yeah, but in Chicago, you got the Grand Terrace, everybody comes. So it was a very comfortable situation. They had hot mic recordings there. Sometimes they broadcast from the Grand Terrace 7 nights a week. So the Hines band was being heard all over the country 7 nights a week. So he has become the Johnny Appleseed of jazz. And young players like Nat King Cole are listening and learning about this music. Yeah, how about that? And so many others are listening and learning about this music by listening to the Hines recordings. Now, although he was from Pittsburgh, during the summers, he did something that very few people would do that lived up north. He would do a 3-month Southern tour. That's right. Black people from the north volunteering in the 30s to tour in the seat of the Confederacy. Oh yeah. He did it. And there were challenges. When you're on the train, you can't eat until everybody else is eating and the place is being closed. Now you can come in there and eat. And Father Hines liked to talk about diplomacy with the Southern conservatives, shall we say. He was immaculate. He dressed. He loved his clothes. That was one thing that Al Capone liked about him. He dressed like Al. He was sharp all the time. Al liked that. You represented me in my club. You dressed like, oh yeah. You're on tour down the South, and you go to this clothing store, and this owner decides to treat him like a former slave. And Earl said, I see what's going on here. So he goes, he makes it clear to the man that he lacks clothes. And he lacks a few of the shirts he has, and his plan is to spend $85 on shirts. Now, $85 would be about $900 with today's money. And in a small southern town, you can sell $900 shirts a day. Believe me, you're going to change your attitude regardless of the color of the man who got the money. Because right now, you like Al Capone, I like green. He said it was amazing how much money changed a man's attitude. And that is how Earl Hines and his boys were able to tour the South for 3 months at a time every year. They wanted to take this big band down to the South, and they wanted to give Southern black folks the benefit of what the Northern black folks had, real big band swing jazz at its best. Because after all, he was famous in the South from those radio broadcasts. Did I tell you that Al Capone loved him so much that he even went out and bought him a gigantic white Steinway grand piano so he wouldn't have to beat so hard to play. He even let him hire extra piano players so sometimes he could just stand there and conduct and just be the man of the hour. Yeah, Father Hines had it going on until 1940, when all of a sudden the club closed. And that was because the manager of the club, one of Capone's boys, cigar-smoking guy, just disappeared. I've worked from clubs like that in my younger days, and I know what that means. That guy was messing with the money. And when you mess with the money, you get rubbed out. And I mean rubbed out. No trace of you was ever found. And that's what happened in that situation. It's at the same time it was started on a war. Next thing you know, members of the Hines organization are being drafted to go into World War II. It's hard to keep a big band going. So what does he do? He goes down to a 7-piece group, continues his thing in New York, and here we go, our next chapter in the life of Mr. Earl Fatha Hines. In that small group association, he reacquaints himself with Louis Armstrong, who is now very, very famous in New York. Matter of fact, during the time that Fatha Hines and Louis were actually working together, Louis appeared on the front cover of Time magazine. Imagine what that must have been for Fatha Hines, who in Chicago was much more celebrated than Louis had been, and lasted much longer in that room known as the Sunset Grand Terrace than Louis did. And that old fission that had developed from that agreement that got broken years ago in 1927 when they promised to stay together and didn't, that started again. And over time, even in a small group situation, the tension between Fatha Hines and Louis Armstrong became so great that they could not play together any longer. But this was at least a re-entry to the big world of jazz for Fatha Hines, and he used that to continue doing that whole thing. And when the small group thing did not last, he went into doing solo piano. And some of his best recordings are his solo piano recordings. You need to get them. Some of the finest of his recordings are those solo piano recordings, because in a lot of cases, he would just sit and improvise. Very, very creative man. And then you get the rock and roll era, and jazz becomes jazz. Me ain't listen to that mess. Baby, give me some rock and roll, give me some funk, give me some soul. Well, Father Hines got a bunch of money. Did I tell you he had a bunch of money? He had a bunch of money. He had a bunch of money. So he moves to California and intends to retire. He becomes a tobaccoist, cigar shop. Hang around, smoking cigars with the boys, making some money, having a little fun. You don't really need to make no money. Everything is great. Yada, 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 yada. Someone says, hey man, you need to start doing this and that. So he started doing a little concert here, a little concert there, mostly solo piano. Next thing you know, this is taking off. So much so that great people get together and buy him a custom-made Steinway. Listen to me, custom-made. This thing was so big, it had 12 legs. Count them, 12 legs. The centipede Steinway. And he kept that piano right to his death, and his career had another resurgence of composition, small groups, solo piano, recordings. Even in his 70s, he was recording as much as 16 albums a year. Let me say it one more time. You almost thought I heard me the first time. In his 70s, he was still recording as much as 16 albums a year. And this is at least the third leg of his very, very long career. So let's talk about his heart just a little bit, because you know he came from very, very humble beginnings. Poor family who actually let him go play professional because it was easier for someone else to pay for his upkeep in terms of room and board than for his mother and father to do it. That's how he got out there with Mr. Depe to begin with. He understood what it was to be poor. So in his will, he mandated that one-of-a-kind Steinway, one of a kind, be auctioned. I have no idea how much money it pulled. I'm not sure if I could even find that. Here's what I do know. Every penny that was paid by whomever bought that custom Grand Steinway went to establish a scholarship in the Oakland, California area for talented inner city youth. With him dying in '83, you can look around at the jazz musicians that have come out of Oakland, the funk bands that have come out of Oakland, etc., that still come, how Tower Power has remade itself 1,000 times, how Santana has remade itself 1,000 times, all the jazz that is there, Sheila E., etc., etc., etc. There's so much culture and music there. Believe me, many of those great musicians that we listen to today and that we will listen to tomorrow are benefactors of Earl Fatha Hines' generosity, even in his death. Because all through his life, the reason he was able to keep these enormous bands together is that everybody said he was so generous. He paid you well, he treated you well, he was simply a very good man, and also happened to be one of the most creative, inventive musicians. He set the pace for Bud Powell and Herbie Hancock and Chick Corea and all the pianists that followed him. The big bands he had in 1940, 1942 had Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie in it, and those musicians from that Hines band, they were the guys that were going to Minton's late at night jamming with Thelonious Monk and creating this new music called bebop. Even after the sunset went from Louis Armstrong to Cab Calloway to Hines, at the very end, those musicians out of the Callaway Band and Hines Band, they were the ones that fostered the transition from swing to bebop and opened the door to modern jazz. And that's why it's so special that Earl Fatha Hines came to us in 1903 and did not leave physically until 1983. You see, he had work to do, and he did the work. And if not for him, jazz would be a very different music today. Thank you, Fatha Hines, and thank you for listening.